I have good news, Jets fans. Sauce Gardner, Breece Hall, and Garrett Wilson can get even better in 2025. That is, if the Jets coaching staff knows how to use them. Let's make the Jets' best players even better today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Friday, May 30th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. A little programming note here. As you longtime listeners know, as the calendar turns from May to June, we kind of scale things back. We will move into a summer schedule next week where we'll still have episodes, but we may not go Monday through Friday. But stay tuned because we will still have plenty of episodes. And once training camp gets underway, we'll be back to 5 days a week. But on today's show, we're going to talk about some of the best players on the New York Jets. We're going to talk about Garrett Wilson. We're going to talk about Breece Hall. And we're going to talk about Sauce Gardner. And all three of these guys have something in common. These are phenomenal talents the Jets drafted 3 years ago in 2022. All three of them have gotten off to excellent starts in their careers. And all three of them can get even better in 2025 if the Jets coaching staff, this new Jets coaching staff, deploys them in smarter ways. So let's start by talking about Sauce Gardner. And I think that this Jets defense is undergoing a transition. It's something we've talked a lot about over the last couple of months since the hiring of Aaron Glenn. Under Robert Saleh and Jeff Ulbrich, the cornerbacks have been the second most important position on the defense. The most important spot's been the defensive line. And that reflects the Robert Saleh, Jeff Ulbrich mindset that you want to rush four guys and play coverage with seven. So when you only rush four guys, those guys got to be really good because it's 4 against 5. You have four defensive linemen rushing against 5 offensive linemen. So essentially, you really only have 3 one-on-ones. Somebody's going to get doubled. If it's 5-on-4, one person's going to get doubled. So it means you only have 3 guys with one-on-ones. Aaron Glenn's going to bring a big-time blitzing defense. And that means the Jets will send 5 pass rushers on a lot of occasions. That means it's 5-on-5. That means 5 one-on-ones. So that means 1 out of 5 guys needs to win to get to the quarterback versus the Robert Saleh, Jeff Ulbrich defense where 1 out of 3 had to do it. The numbers favor getting to the quarterback when you blitz. But it makes it tougher to play coverage because the dynamics change. You go from 5 receivers eligible versus 7 defenders playing back to 5 versus 6. And if you're since you're always going to have a deep safety play as the last line of defense, it's really 5-on-5. That deep safety is there to prevent catastrophes, there to provide help over the top. But you're going to see a lot of man coverage, and this is where Sauce Gardner excels. And I think there's a real opportunity for the Jets to unlock Sauce Gardner this year because you'll see a lot of man coverage. And, across the NFL, a great zone corner brings a lot to the table. Zone is like the primary coverage scheme in the NFL these days. It's a lot, there are lots of elements to that. So, a big one of them is just the spread offenses that utilize all 5 eligible receivers. So if you play a lot of man-to-man, it can leave you vulnerable. But the Jets, if you have the guys who can cover man-to-man, then you can do it. If you have strong cover guys, then you can play man-to-man. And that begins with a number 1 corner. And Sauce Gardner is a number 1 corner. Difficult 2024, but guy who was a first-team All-Pro his first 2 years in the league. But I think there's one other element, in addition to increasing the rate the Jets play man-to-man, that can really make Sauce Gardner a tremendously valuable player. And that will require the Jets to have Sauce Gardner follow the other team's best receiver across the formation. Normally Sauce Gardner under Robert Saleh, Jeff Ulbrich, he went to the left side, and he took whoever came to the left side. If that was the number 1 receiver, great. If it was the number 2 receiver, okay. It didn't really make that big of a difference because the Jets had DJ Reed on the right side. So, if even the other team's number 1 receiver went away from Sauce Gardner, you still had a really good cover guy in DJ Reed there. But it also, it didn't matter because the Jets were playing a lot of zone. And ultimately, Sauce Gardner is going to cover the guy that comes into his zone. That's the way it is. It's you can't really determine matchups when you're playing zone because your corner's playing a defined area of the field. So he's covering whoever's there. When you play man-to-man, you can determine which receiver your best corner covers. And there are different philosophies in the NFL. There are some coaches who like to just have their corner stay on the same side of the field. They kind of say, like, we'll get you used to playing the angles on this side of the field. If the other team's best receiver comes to you, fine. If the other team's number 2 receiver comes to you, fine. I'd like to see the Jets have Sauce Gardner, though, shadow the other team's best receiver across the field, whether he goes left or right. It's not something Jeff Ulbrich and Robert Saleh did a lot. And truth be told, it's not something Aaron Glenn did all that much in Detroit. There were special games where he'd have his number 1 corner follow the other team's best receiver. But Glenn tended to be a coach in Detroit who just played sides of the field. But I think the situation in New York's a little bit different because I don't think he had some good corners in Detroit. Carlton Davis, their number 1 corner last year, was a pretty good corner. He didn't have a Sauce Gardner level talent, though. When Rex Ryan came to the Jets in 2009, and I don't want to put it on Sauce Gardner that he has to be Darrelle Revis, but Rex Ryan really kind of helped unlock Darrelle Revis. Darrelle Revis was off to a really good start in his career. He made the Pro Bowl in 2008. I don't think people really realized how good Darrelle Revis was when Rex Ryan took the Jets over, because Darrelle Revis was a top-notch corner already at that point. But what Rex Ryan did is he played a lot of man-to-man coverage also. He blitzed a lot also. And he had Revis follow the other team's best receiver. In 2009, Revis had a season for the ages. He faced the other team's number 1 receiver 2 out of 3 plays. 66% of the time that year, Darrelle Revis was lined up against the other team's best receiver. Revis followed the best receiver around. And that 2/3 figure actually undersells the extent to which Revis followed the other team's best receiver, because there were some games where the other team didn't really have that big of a receiving threat. And then if in those games, if the other team didn't really have a legitimate number 1 receiver, then the Jets would just keep it simple. The Jets would simplify their defense. It'd be Revis go to the left, Lito Shepherd goes to the right. And if the other team didn't have a great receiver, they said, okay, Lito Shepherd can cover that guy. So Revis only did that against the teams that were really, really top-notch teams that had really, really top-notch number 1 receivers. I mean, he did it against Andre Johnson. He did it against Randy Moss. He did it against Steve Smith that year. Those were the types of receivers Revis drew. And Revis essentially played those guys the whole game. And that's an advantage that you have, because this is obviously a passing league. And there is such an emphasis on teams when they have a number 1 receiver trying to get them the ball. And when you have a guy who can erase that type of player, when you have a corner with the ability of a Sauce Gardner who legitimately can erase another team's number 1 receiver, he has that kind of skill. You should utilize it, especially if you're running the type of defense that's going to require heavy blitzing. The Robert Saleh, Jeff Ulbrich defense, it worked well in 2022 and 2023. It's difficult to argue with the results. I mean, I'm not criticizing their approach. I mean, they went out and ran the defense really well. They invested in the defensive line. They got a lot of depth there, had a lot of quality players that were getting great snaps on the defensive line throughout the entire game. And the Jets generated a ton of pressure. If you can do that and have success, there's no problem with it. But there's also no problem with installing a defense that's heavier blitzing, a lot more man-to-man coverage, and leaning on the talent of Sauce Gardner. Because, you look across from Sauce Gardner, Brandon Stevens, you can have hopes for him. We certainly hope he's going to turn out to be good, but he's no DJ Reed. He's not a guy you'd want to trust with the other team's number 1 receiver. You want Sauce Gardner covering the other team's elite receivers practically the whole game. And this is the type of thing that can just make Sauce Gardner one of the most valuable players in the league. If Sauce Gardner shakes off that 2024 shaky season and gets back to his 2022-2023 form and plays a lot of man-to-man and shuts down the other team's number 1 receiver, Sauce Gardner has the ability to be defensive player of the year. There aren't a lot of players you enter the season where you say that guy has the talent to be defensive player of the year. Sauce Gardner has the ability to be the defensive player of the year in the right scheme. If he's playing a lot of man coverage and taking the other team's number 1 receiver for the entire game. And that's why, to maximize Sauce Gardner, it makes sense to have him follow the other team's number 1 receiver, because the Jets will play plenty of man coverage this year. And Sauce Gardner can be a human eraser against elite receivers. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to the offensive side of the ball. If we're going to be honest, the offensive side of the ball is where the Jets need a lot of help. Breece Hall had a bit of a disappointing 2024 season. Jets are looking for a 2025 bounce back, and he's going to have to play a big role in the offense. There are 2 things that I think can get the most out of Breece Hall. 2 adjustments the Jets coaching staff needs to make. I'll tell you what they are as we continue here on this Friday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA playoffs are in full swing, and every night delivers highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments. Whether it's a game-winning shot or a breakout player, there's never been a better time to get in on the action. And FanDuel makes it easy to stay in the game before tip-off and live. With player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays, fans have more ways than ever to play smart and win big. And of course, we're in New York. A lot of you Jets fans are also Knicks fans. Knicks stay alive. It's a long road back, but it's now a little bit shorter. If you think the Knicks can pull it off, FanDuel's a great way to get in on the action. And of course, if you're looking forward to the NFL season, maybe you're not a basketball fan, that 5.5 over-under win total for the Jets on FanDuel, if you believe in the Jets, maybe it looks attractive. Well, no matter how you want to bet, FanDuel is the best way to get in on the action. Are you new to FanDuel? Well, it's the perfect time to sign up. Head to FanDuel.com and place your first $5 bet. And if it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the National Basketball Association. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. We're talking about 3 key Jets players today. All of them drafted in 2022, all of them successful players in the pros. We talked about Sauce Gardner. Now let's talk about Breece Hall. And on today's show, we're focused on how the Jets coaching staff can get even more out of these guys who have already succeeded. Breece Hall had what I think by all accounts was kind of a disappointing 2024. Only 876 yards on 209 carries, a 4.2 average, which is pretty pedestrian. His pass catching numbers went down. What does this mean? Well, he got off to a really slow start. He had a rough month of September and then bounced back. He played pretty well after September, but there weren't as many home run plays last year for Breece. It was something we've discussed on the show is how he wasn't producing. He only produced 8 plays of 20 yards or more from scrimmage versus 14 in 2023. So he cut his explosive play total just about in half. How do we get back to the Breece Hall of 2022 and 2023? Well, I think that there's something schematic the Jets can do to improve Breece's performance. And it's something that I've picked up on watching the film. Now, one of the things that you hear a lot about Breece is that his running style did not mesh with the Jets offensive line because the Jets haven't been that talented of a run blocking offensive line the last couple of years. And people always say Breece is patient like Le'Veon Bell. So Breece will kind of dance around the backfield waiting for a hole to open. And a lot of people compare that to Le'Veon Bell. And I've kind of come to the conclusion that Le'Veon Bell has been the best thing that's ever happened to running backs who aren't good at reading blocks, because people look at backs being indecisive and they kind of conclude, oh, he's patient like Le'Veon Bell. Le'Veon Bell was a back who was patient. It was famous for being patient, waiting for holes to open, because he could kind of see the flow of blocks. And sometimes he'd wait in the backfield and then the hole would open. It would take a couple seconds. He'd see that a hole would develop in a couple seconds. He'd wait for it, and then hit the hole. And it's funny because when he was in college at Michigan State, he was really criticized for being too patient. A lot of people, including people on the Michigan State coaching staff, told him, you got to hit the hole sooner. You can't keep waiting for the hole to develop. And then there's a story Mike Tomlin went up to him and said, no, you do. I get what you're doing. And Mike Tomlin was the first coach who understood what Le'Veon Bell was doing. Of course, the Steelers drafted him. Bell went on to become a star. And I think that people mistake struggling to read blocks with patience. And I think Breece Hall is a back who's just not great at reading blocks. And that's not the end of the world necessarily. You'd rather have a back who's effective at reading blocks, but we've seen Breece Hall produce big plays through his first couple of seasons. So what do you do with a back who can produce big plays but isn't great at reading blocks? Well, you call more gap runs. A couple different styles of running play in the NFL. There's zone runs and then there's gap runs. And there's also a play called duo. But let's focus on the difference between zone and gap. These get their name because of the blocking assignments. In a zone blocking play, typically you're blocking whatever man comes into a certain area on the field. So it's like a zone. You have a zone. Whatever guy comes in there, is the guy you're blocking. On a gap play, you're typically assigned a man. It's more man-to-man blocking. There are other differences, though. On zone plays, typically the entire line's either moving laterally left or right at the snap. And the reason for that is it's really tough to move a 320-pound nose tackle. It's really tough to drive him forward. So what they do, the idea behind zone plays is when everybody runs laterally, the defensive line has to follow laterally. Otherwise, they'll kind of be outflanked. So what happens is sometimes a defensive lineman runs laterally, overruns the play, and then it becomes easy to block it because then all you have to do is just seal. You just have to get your body between him and the cutback lane. But with everybody moving in one direction, the running back kind of needs to read like which defensive lineman's overrunning his play. Where's my hole? What do I hit? Whereas on a gap play, again, you're just trying to drive the guy forward. You have one guy, your job is just to drive him 10 yards down the field. So the hole's more defined for you. So what's this all have to do with Breece Hall? Again, I don't think Breece Hall is that great at reading blocks, but Breece Hall is a dynamic runner. So on a gap play, he's just getting the ball with the head of steam. He knows which hole to hit. And when Breece Hall gets ahead of steam, he can rip off a 25, 30-yard run like that. So I think there needs to be a bigger diet of gap runs. The Jets have, in Breece Hall's career, have given him a heavy diet of zone runs. In fact, a year ago there was a lot of discussion around the Jets that people kept saying that they were going to switch to a run scheme that was more based on gap blocking than zone blocking, and I didn't really understand the idea that the Jets were going to change schemes because they had the same offensive coordinator and the same offensive line coach. I think it was based on the personnel they brought in that was probably better suited for a gap blocking scheme. But like, why were we expecting Nathaniel Hackett and Keith Carter to install a system that fit the players? There's a pretty big flaw in that logic. But one of the big complaints about Breece Hall behind him being patient is people say that he doesn't run with the power you'd want out of a 220-pound back. And I think this goes back to like what I was talking about is when you're kind of hesitant in the backfield, it doesn't matter how big you are, you're pretty easy to bring down. But when Breece Hall gets ahead of steam, he's tough to bring down. A big 220-pound guy can run through arm tackles. And that's where you want Breece Hall. You want Breece Hall to just get the ball, go down the field, just shoot down the field, because that's where Breece Hall's at his best. So I think that's a big schematic tweak this Jets offense, if coaching staff needs to make as in their first year. The other aspect is I think the Jets need to involve Breece Hall more as a receiver. We know Breece has receiving skills. Of course, 2 years ago, he produced 76 catches for 591 yards. He went from 76 catches in 23 to 57 catches in 2024. Now, a lot of that probably had to do with Devontae Adams being here because the Jets had a second 1,000-yard receiver. 2023, they didn't really have much behind Garrett Wilson. Well, guess what? We're back to a situation where the Jets don't have much behind Garrett Wilson. That means they're going to have to involve Breece Hall more in the passing game. And Tanner Engstrand, of course, comes from Detroit. Detroit's typically among the league leaders in running screen passes. Especially the 2 years, they dropped it in 2024, but 2023, Jared Goff had one of the highest rates of screen passes in the league. And, speaking about like where the Jets are going with Justin Fields, we've discussed this, that Justin Fields is still a work in progress as a passer. So you're going to have to find ways to manufacture offense. And one of the best ways is to utilize the screen game. It's funny because it's a really simple concept. And sometimes like NFL teams come up with like these really complex plays and they dismiss the simple stuff. In fact, you hear this all the time when like somebody suggests running a college type play and people say, well, that's a college type play. It's too simple to work in the NFL. Well, if you run a simple play, if you run it with world-class athletes and execute at a high level, any play can work. So I think a heavy diet of screens will be in order for the Jets this year. And Breece Hall is going to be a great guy to throw those screens to. And Breece can run routes. He's not like a Christian McCaffrey type where he's a wide receiver playing running back. He's not a great route runner, but he can run a decent route here and there. He can run a good angle route out of the backfield and shake a linebacker. So you can utilize him that way, but also make sure he's involved in the passing game. 2 years ago when Breece had those 76 catches, Nathaniel Hackett, the famous quote that he didn't realize at the start of the year what a weapon Breece Hall was in the receiving game. Well, there's no excuse to not know it now. Tanner Engstrand should figure it out. And I think a bounce back season from Breece Hall has two components. One, more gap runs, two, utilize him more in the passing game. Now, as you're on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about the player who will be utilized most in the Jets passing game. That's Garrett Wilson. There's no question Garrett's going to be among the league leaders in targets once again, but there are ways the Jets have used him where he can be really effective that the Jets haven't used enough in the past. I'll tell you what they are as we continue here on this Friday edition of Locked On Jets. This is the Locked On Jets podcast. On this Friday, we're talking Jets draft class of 2022, a phenomenal draft class, one of the best draft classes in Jets history. Only 3 years in, that draft class has produced 4 quality players for this team. Sauce Gardner, Breece Hall, Jermaine Johnson, and the guy we're going to discuss in the last segment, Garrett Wilson. Garrett Wilson's career to date has been excellent. There's no other way to put it. 3 seasons in the league, 3,000-yard seasons. Under any circumstance, that would be really good. Under the circumstances Garrett Wilson's had to operate in, where he has not had good quarterback play, where he has not had particularly good coaching on the offensive side of the ball. In fact, in 2023 and the first quarter of 2024, the coaching was abysmal. The coaching was, some of the worst coaching we've seen in recent NFL history, with Nathaniel Hackett running the offense. But, even Todd Downing and Mike LaFleur weren't as bad as Nathaniel Hackett, but nobody's going to say that those guys are elite offensive minds. And just overall, the Jets haven't really surrounded Garrett with great talent. I mean, they did have Devontae Adams for the last 3 quarters of 2024, but he's been the number one receiver and really hasn't had a lot of help from his supporting cast. Unfortunately for the Jets, it's probably not going to change a whole lot in 2025. As we talked about in the last segment, Breece Hall is going to have to be a big part of the passing game. And there's something to be said for having a running back who can catch balls out of the backfield. There's something to be said for having a running back who can produce explosive plays as a receiver, the way Breece Hall has done throughout his career. But there's no good number 2 receiver. In fact, this is an offense where the Jets are going to – we've talked about this over the last week or so on the show. Jets are going to have to manufacture some things on the offensive side of the ball. And a lot of that's going to fall to offensive coordinator Tanner Engstrand, as we discussed yesterday. I think that it's weird to say, like, Garrett Wilson's usage should change, because, again, like, the Jets have used him a lot. He's been among the league leaders in targets for, the last couple of years. He's a guy that's been like the go-to guy on the Jets offense. So, it's not so, I mean, I'm not sure it's so much the Jets are going to use him more, but I think the Jets need to use him differently. I think they need to be creative with how they utilize him, because there's really no question that Garrett is going to be the focal point of other teams' coverage. He's going to draw the number 1 corners on when teams do what I'm suggesting the Jets do with Sauce Gardner. When they put their number 1 corner on the other team's best receiver, Garrett Wilson's going to draw that coverage. And when teams are trying to focus on shutting someone down, that guy's going to be Garrett Wilson. He's going to be the guy that sees double teams. He's going to be the guy that sees safety help over the top. Now, the thing about Garrett Wilson is he's a good enough route runner that he's still going to produce. He'll still be able to get open, because those double teams do have weak points. And Garrett Wilson's really adept at finding the soft spot in those double teams and exploiting that. So Garrett Wilson's still going to produce. But this Jets offense is going to need to, figure out how to manufacture plays. And part of that, as we discussed yesterday, will be utilizing Justin Fields' ability as a runner. But I think there are ways the Jets can utilize Garrett where they haven't necessarily utilized him to maximum effect through his first 3 seasons. And, one of these areas is going to be using him more in the slot. I mean, it's not that the Jets never use him in the slot. The Jets actually use Garrett Wilson in the slot quite a bit. But I think you're going to want to see more and more of him in the slot this year, because there's going to be so much focus on taking him away, and it's much more difficult to cover a guy out of the slot. And that's, there are a couple elements to it. First of all, is that you're not lined up on the line of scrimmage, so it's tougher to jam you. There's always at least one wide receiver who has to line up literally on the line of scrimmage, so the corner can line up right across from him and just try and throw his arm out and obstruct the receiver's route. And Garrett Wilson's not, he's not small, super small, but he's a little undersized. He's not the strongest receiver. There are different styles of receiver. There's some guys who really, aren't going to be bothered by jams at the line of scrimmage. Garrett Wilson's not among them. Garrett Wilson is a guy who you can kind of throw off his game by jamming him. But if you're in the slot, you line up a little bit behind the line of scrimmage, so it's tougher to get a jam on you. But when you're in the slot, you also have the whole field to work with. You can run vertical, but you can also run left to right. That's not available to you on the outside, because on the outside, you have the sideline either to the left, you have to the right of you. So it limits your route tree. And especially a guy who's a very crafty route runner like Garrett Wilson will be able to exploit playing in the slot. And I think that's where the Jets want to play him, to get him at maximum impact. But I also think like the Jets don't do enough to manufacture touches for Garrett Wilson. I think that he'd be a guy who's going to be very tough to deal with in space, because the guy who is so effortless moving left or moving right, he doesn't lose any speed. He just kind of glides when he changes direction. He's a guy really pretty good at making defenders look foolish in the open field. And that's something you haven't really seen with the Jets. In fact, I'm about to cite a classic episode of Seinfeld right now. There's this episode where Jerry Seinfeld meets his uncle Leo at the diner that they always go to, and Jerry doesn't really like Uncle Leo. And Uncle Leo goes, Jerry, we got to do this once a week. And you see like how upset Jerry is when Uncle Leo suggests we do this once a week. Let's talk about the screen game now. The Jets only threw Garrett Wilson 9 screens last year. So they threw him a screen about once every other week. I think the Jets ought to take some advice from Uncle Leo, at least once a week. In fact, I'd like to get that number up to 20 this year. Let's say more than once a week. Because again, this Jets offense is not going to move the ball by dropping the quarterback, in the pocket 30 times a game. They have to find other ways to do it. And part of it will be utilizing the quarterback's running skills. Part of it will be, using Breece Hall in dynamic ways. But part of it will be just making things easy. If Garrett Wilson's available, if Garrett Wilson can catch the ball out of the on a screen and get the ball in open field and make plays, that's an easy way to get to rip off 6-7 yards, and something the Jets ought to utilize. And Garrett Wilson only had 2 rushing attempts this year. Now, he's not a burner. I think Arian Smith's going to be the guy that they manufacture a lot of these design runs for at the receiver position. But again, figure out ways to get Garrett the ball. I mean, I don't think you have to give Garrett a running play once a week, but I'd like to see him utilize his skills as a runner more frequently, because he's a tough guy. When he catches the ball in the open field, he makes moves. He can make guys miss. He's got that type of skill set. Maybe you don't think of him this way because the guys you think about as great after the catch guys are either guys who are absolute burners or the big guys where defenders just kind of throw themselves at the receiver and fall off them because they're so tough to tackle in the open field. And of course, that neither of those is Garrett Wilson's game. And receivers a position where there's just so many different styles where you can have success. There are certain positions where you can only be good doing one. There's only 1 or 2 ways to be good. A receiver, there are probably 5 or 6 different ways you can be effective. And Garrett Wilson's effective by being a crafty route runner, but Garrett Wilson's also effective by just the suddenness and the subtleness of his movements with the ball in his hands. Jets have utilized his abilities as a route runner quite a bit, and they've done it very effectively, but I don't think they've done enough to utilize his movement skills with the ball in his hands, because he's a guy who can create a lot of missed tackles with those. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and you're listening on the podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, please give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your weekend, everybody. Again, next week, we'll move into a summer schedule, but we still will have episodes. So again, subscribe so that you'll get notifications as new episodes are posted. We'll talk to you next week and continue covering this Jets offseason. I look forward to it.